President Donald Trump has a clear objective in Venezuela: regime change. Since taking office, he has employed diplomatic and economic pressure on Caracas, but the strategy has failed to deliver a breakthrough. Now, the idea of military intervention in the oil-rich South American nation is gaining momentum in the Pentagon. Trump even went on record to say that the US military could easily topple Nicolas Maduro and that all options are on the table. Even though the possibility of military involvement in Venezuela remains unlikely, the odds are higher than they have been at any moment in the crisis. So, what if the White House follows through? How would an American assault on Venezuela play out? I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Digital life makes things easier, but it also leaves fingerprints whenever you're using apps for shopping, banking, or whenever you're connected to public Wi-Fi. NordVPN hides your IP and thereby secures your devices from malicious websites, ISP operators, etc. It works even when you're away from home. Visit nordvpn.com/CaspianReport and use the promo code CaspianReport to get 70% off this powerful app. The tragedy of Venezuela is hurting not just its citizens, but also tearing at the socio-economic fabric of the nations across the periphery. Refugees are pouring into Colombia, Maduro is blaming the electricity blackouts on US cyber attacks, while Trump has designated the government in Caracas as illegitimate. At one point last year, military intervention now in Spanish rose as the most trending topic on Twitter. But for an armed conflict to start, there must be an initial spark, a sort of Gulf of Tonkin moment that would involve non-Venezuelans and brand Maduro as the undisputed aggressor. The most likely place for this to occur would be by the Colombian border, where Venezuelan refugees intermingle with non-state militias on a daily basis and where incidents sometimes result in the exchange of gunfire. A serious armed incident, like an attack on the nearby energy facilities or cross-border checkpoints, could spin the wheel of escalation, especially since there are no diplomatic or military contacts between the governments of Colombia and Venezuela. For outsiders, this may seem implausible, but for the local policymakers, it is daily routine. In July 2018, a longtime Chavista government official argued for the Venezuelan Air Force to bomb bridges over the Magdalena River that traverses Colombia. Whatever justification was used by the Chavista lawmaker, that is the sort of episode that would drag the United States into the fight. US Vice President Mike Pence and US Ambassador to Colombia Kevin Whitaker have both offered security guarantees to Colombia should it suffer military belligerence from Venezuela. So let's imagine that the pretext for an armed conflict is in place and the ball is in the court of the United States. The early phase of the conflict would likely involve an aerial bombardment, either in the form of precision strikes or shock and awe. In the case of precision strikes, the Pentagon will need to eliminate Maduro's security and economic infrastructure. The objective of such surgical attacks will be to cripple the ties that bind the political elite and the military hierarchy, but this will be difficult to accomplish. Although precision strikes are depicted as cost-effective, they are also wildly unpredictable. In Libya in 2011 and Yugoslavia in 1999, the situation on the ground became so volatile that American policymakers gained little to no ability to shape the political outcome. Plus, surgical strikes can be extensively detrimental. It will be difficult to operate with precision in densely populated areas, no matter how much planning is put in or how advanced the employed weaponry is. Collateral damage will be unavoidable. Civilians will be killed, and the public infrastructure will be destroyed. In the second scenario, shock and awe, the United States would use crushing physical force to paralyze the Venezuelan military's will to fight and force Maduro and his inner circle to leave power swiftly. The trouble with the doctrine of rapid dominance is that the spectacular display of brute force usually destroys all means of communication, transportation, food production, water supply, and other aspects of public infrastructure. So the conflict ends soon after, but the rebuilding process takes much longer because the infrastructure has to be reconstructed from the ground up. Anarchy would take hold of the country. Militias and armed thugs would roam the streets and wreak havoc on the populace. Some 8 million civilians who are already in need of humanitarian assistance would likely flee the country if the Pentagon opted for shock and awe. Either way, for an aerial operation, the US Navy would need to station a carrier strike group off the coast of Venezuela. 1 or 2 aircraft carriers are enough to enforce a no-fly zone over the country, while groups of American battleships and submarines would launch a steady stream of Tomahawk missiles at air bases, air defense facilities, and command and control centers across Venezuela. At the same time, cyber weapons would need to be employed to destroy the national defenses. The wild card here is Russia. Although the Russians will not commit troops, the Kremlin has the capacity for cheaper, less intrusive ways of intervention. Think of cyber attacks, assassinations, disinformation, etc. Russia also has the means to supply Venezuela's military with fuel, ammunition, and intelligence. Potentially, this would prolong open hostilities. If somehow the aerial bombardments fail to dislodge Maduro from power, the Pentagon would have no choice but to go all in and commit to an extended urban struggle. At least 150,000 American troops, backed by air support, would be necessary to secure and destroy the remaining government-controlled oil deposits, power stations, communication facilities, and so on. American contingents would face some 160,000 regular Venezuelan troops and more than 100,000 paramilitaries. This is the worst case scenario, because it would pin down American resources for a longer duration of time and result in far higher US casualties than initially anticipated. An all-out assault could go down in many ways, but in each case, the hostilities are likely to end quickly. The top officials of the Maduro government are either forced into exile or killed in action. Either way, following the invasion of American troops, the White House would immediately appoint Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. However, to claim legitimacy, the interim leadership would have to schedule free and fair elections as quickly as logistically possible. In the meantime, the presence of the US military will push Venezuela's paramilitary groups and militias into hiding. Even after the elections, the new government in Caracas will need time, security, and stability to establish a new civil service and a security apparatus. Inevitably, the task of ensuring security and stability will fall upon the United States, and US troops will have to remain in Venezuela for years. It is difficult to say how long such an occupation would last. When taking lessons from history, the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti lasted 13 years, while the military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq have continued now for nearly 2 decades after the initial invasion. Meanwhile, the last Latin American nation that was invaded by the United States was Panama in 1989. The conflict lasted only 42 days, but the US military operations continued for another 4 years. Venezuela is free of the kind of sectarian issues that plague Afghanistan, but its geography is twice the size of Iraq, while the total population is 8 times that of Panama. It's not hard to imagine that the US occupation of Venezuela and the reconstruction of the state would take a decade or more. In the meantime, after the initial invasion, the election of the new government, and the purging of Chavista officials, citizens will want to see rapid improvements in their lives. The reconstruction of infrastructure will take tens of billions of dollars, but more importantly, it will take time. It is at this phase where Venezuela's insurgency is likely to move to the forefront. Much like in Iraq, a post-conflict Venezuela would be plagued by insurgents committing acts of asymmetrical warfare. There is no way to measure the Chavista capacity for guerrilla combat. Venezuela has between 500,000 and 2 million militias. They come in all shapes and sizes and go by various names. Most of them lack training, discipline, and motivation. Still, if even 1/10 of the low estimate commits to a fight, that's over 50,000 insurgents. At its peak, Colombia's FARC had half those numbers and still managed to paralyze the state. Besides the Chavista militias, there are also armed units such as the colectivos, who have the means to financially sustain themselves through illicit revenue streams like extortion, fuel piracy, cocaine traffic, etc. Even without a unified leadership structure, the Chavista militias and the colectivos would technically have the numbers, the funding, and the weaponry to launch a nationwide rebellion. Should the insurgency take hold, it would make governance nearly impossible in the countryside. In turn, it would ask even more US commitment in terms of military power, but also in areas of finance, intelligence, civilian planning, government assistance, etc. Due to the insurgency, America's occupation of Venezuela would extend for an additional few years. Even if the whole endeavor is only a tiny fraction of the costs of the Iraqi and Afghan occupations, military intervention in Venezuela would cost in the tens of billions of dollars, and that is a conservative estimate. Armed conflict is often prolonged, ugly, and results in massive casualties. But in Venezuela's case, the social, economic, and security costs of military involvement would be completely counterproductive. It is a no-win situation if you go in. The damage would outweigh the benefits by a wide margin. Even limiting the military campaign to airborne operations would enforce the tragedy of Venezuela across the continent. The United States has a long and complicated history of military interference in South America, and they've always been deemed unpopular and counterproductive. Venezuela sits on the extreme end of that spectrum. It's safe to say that due to these existing hazards on the ground, the White House will refrain from military action. In this context, the threats that the Pentagon and the White House have made are not signs of imminent military assault, but instead a signal to the opposition in Venezuela that America would support an internal coup in Caracas. It is meant to incite the Venezuelan military leadership to overthrow Maduro without needing action by Washington's end. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you approve of our content, hit the like button, subscribe, and comment. Any of these help to bypass YouTube's algorithms and spread our videos over a larger audience. Thank you for watching, and Sawal.